Hey, what's up, tribe? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the TFC Audio Project Down Under. This week I chat with Paul Wood from Brisbane Backyard Bees, who we are collaborating with for our new honeybeam project. Throughout the conversation, we talk about the critical importance of bees for human and planetary health, the main issues that are causing bee depopulation, the benefits of beekeeping for both bees and humans, as well as the amazing and mysterious inner workings of the beehive.
As James just alluded to there, we do have a new project underway and we're stoked to be launching our honeybeams this week. They're bright honeybee yellow and have a cool new symbol on them. They come in 90 centimetre and 120 centimetre lengths, and all of the profits from the sale of these beams will go towards Project Bee in partnership with Brisbane Backyard Bees. The money will be used to help build and maintain hives at our Natural Experience Centre that's under construction west of Brisbane, TFC Bush 1. To support the cause, head to tfc-shopaus.com to check them out.
All right, so Paul, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So we just had a meeting. We're here in your beautiful backyard, actually, with I can see a bunch of bees buzzing around, which is always nice. Mm-hmm. But we just had a meeting about our upcoming honeybeam project and figured it would be a great opportunity to just jump on the podcast and chat through all things bees and your approach with bees and what you do. And yeah, it's such an important subject. The more I learn about it from you and from other people that I hear on podcasts and stuff, then the more it makes sense that it's really something that needs to be talked a lot more about. Mm-hmm. So usually I just start with getting a bit of background about yourself, sort of what you do and why you do it, and then we can just roll from there.
Cool. Okay. So yes, Paul, Brisbane Backyard Bees. It grew. So this is my little business in Brisbane. I supply hives and bees, top bar hives, which are at the very natural end of beekeeping. Mm-hmm. The focus of a top bar hive is very much about supporting the natural cycles of the bees. So I came into bees sort of almost accidentally about 10 years ago. I've always been into gardening, permaculture type stuff, and I realised bees needed to be a part of our food system, not intending to be a beekeeper necessarily, but I went on a workshop and stuck my head in a beehive, and my world changed. I was very captivated by bees, and I came home, built a hive, got bees into it, and it grew from there. I started building extra hives, forcing my friends to have them, and yes, and since then people come to me and I supply their hives and bees, and I support their learning as a new beekeeper, and do workshops and a whole load of peripheral things as well. Like I take bees out of walls and ceilings. Suburban beekeeping means that because we don't have a lot of natural places for bees to inhabit in suburbia, they do tend to go into man-made structures a bit. So I also take bees out of those sorts of places.
Yeah. And that's where you get your bees, that you then rehouse, I suppose, rehome, rehive.
That's one of the places I get bees. So yes, obviously I'm selling hives and bees to people. I need to get bees from somewhere. So there are 3-ish ways that I get bees. One, as you've suggested, is getting them out of walls and ceilings. That's a bit erratic, the supply of bees. Yeah. I have my own hives, of course, and I split those periodically. So when a hive is robust enough, I will split it to create a new colony. So that's another way that I can supply bees. And another very important way is swarming. So springtime is when beehives naturally reproduce. They're split in half. The old queen leaves with half the workers. They're set up, temporarily they park in a tree or on your garden furniture or somewhere, and people ring me and say, I've got a swarm in my backyard, can you come and get it? So that is another important source of my bees.
And I guess that's how they get into the houses. Like if they get into a roof or a hole in a wall or something like that, that's from a swarm.
Right. And typically, I mean, it's a tricky dilemma here, because when a hive swarms, it's a beautiful thing. We're actually discouraged by the Department of Agriculture to have our hive swarm, but swarming is a natural process of reproduction. So ultimately, there are things you can tweak to discourage swarming, but hives will swarm. A healthy hive will swarm, and so it's a little bit of a shame to interfere with this process, because they will park in a tree for 2 or 3 days, sending out scouts looking for that new home, and we're asking people in suburbia, ring a beekeeper when you see a swarm, and we intervene in that quite beautiful process and take the bees out of that tree and say, no, you're not going into those walls or ceilings.
Right.
We're going to give you a much more suitable home for suburbia. But yes, if no one spots that swarm, typically after 2 or 3 days, they've identified a perfect little cavity in a house, and they move in there. And then it becomes problematic trying to get them out. We can get them out, but not everyone wants me to make a hole in their wall. So it's best if we pick up the swarm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you got into bees through an interest in permaculture and growing your own food and things like that. Talk to me about why bees are... I mean, Mac and I did a workshop with you, so we do sort of have a bit of background information, but tell people why the bees are so important for food systems.
Sure. So at some point in history, a relationship was created between flowers and insects, and insects realized they could get protein from pollen, and the flower world, the plant world, accommodated these insects by producing more pollen-y flowers that produce pollen, and as an added incentive, nectar. So this relationship between bees and flowers has been going for millions of years, and it is at the core of our food system currently. When a bee collects pollen from a flower, that's the protein that it needs to take back to the hive. That pollen is the reproductive cell of the plant, right? That pollen needs to get shifted onto another flower in order for that flower to produce its fruit, and that fruit may be a fruit that we're familiar with, oranges, lemons, cucumbers, whatever, or vegetable or nuts. And so that process of the bees moving that pollen from flower to flower is essential. If that did not happen, that flower would not produce one of those fruits. So yes, we've become very dependent upon bees for our food, and it is commonly agreed that probably 30% of the food we put into our bodies requires the services of a bee.
Right.
That's not to take anything away from the other insects that are pollinators. There are many pollinators: insects, ants, flies, wasps, native bees, as well as the honeybees. It's just that the European honeybee is such a prolific pollinator.
And something that really hit home for me in the workshop was you were talking about how the pollination industry, I suppose, is actually even bigger than the honey industry. Is that right? As in, it's actually a huge thing, a huge industry of getting pollinators into areas where pollination is needed.
Sure, yeah. Well, when we say bigger than the honey industry, there is more money in pollination than there is in honey.
Which is fascinating.
It is. And so ideally, we humans, we do farming in a particular way, and we can call that monoculture, basically the planting out of one enormous area of a single crop. Prior to that, the diversity of plants on all of our land meant that the bees could pick and choose between flowers here and there. They could live in many different habitats as long as there was a diversity of plant life. The monoculture system has removed that diversity. So typically, the example that most people often use is almonds. The almonds of California, 1 million acres of almonds in California. Almonds must have a honeybee. So those almonds will not produce. Those almond trees will not produce a nut without a bee. And because there are almond trees as far as the eye can see, there is no other flower. And that almond is going to flower that almond tree will flower for maybe 6 weeks of the year, at which time there is endless forage. There is almond flower everywhere. But outside that window of opportunity for a pollinator, there is nothing. It is effectively a desert. So that's the typical example of how the pollination industry has been created, because we still need that pollinator, even though we've damaged the habitat to such a degree that bees can't live in those monocultures. We still have to bring bees in. Therefore, we create hives that are transportable, that you can stack onto trucks, that you can ship halfway around the world and drop them into these monocultures, forage them on that single pollen, the single protein for 6 weeks, and then move them onto somewhere else. So the farmer, the almond farmer, pays a price per hive for the services of those bees, and then they'd go on to another crop
somewhere else that has a different flowering cycle.
Yeah, so that has become the normal life of so many bees. Yeah,
and like you said, pretty much, well, not ubiquitously, but the majority of farming or agriculture these days is monoculture agriculture, and like you said, that destroys the habitat of the bees because they can only survive on the like, if they were in a certain area and it was all one plant like almonds or something, then they would only be able to eat for 6 weeks of the year, and then they'd have to, I guess, move somewhere else. But
That's right.
It just wouldn't be feasible.
Yeah, pollen is essential to bees all year round. It is their protein. They feed it to the brood. They're producing bees day after day after day. Pollen is necessary for the brood.
Yeah.
So yeah, and without pollen, you don't have a beehive.
Yes. Yeah. And so the diversity, just having more diversity, say in like a backyard setup like you've got, or in say a regenerative agriculture farm where they have, animals and like diverse plant species and all of these things, would probably be the ideal environment for a bee, or would it be more, I guess, like a forest environment?
Yeah. So
depends on the
bees
bee.
Honeybees will travel up to 5 kilometers to forage. So they've got a lot of scope, right? So and in suburbia, within 5 kilometers of my backyard, even though my backyard's full of plants, they're not tied. The boundary means nothing to bees. They will travel across suburbia and they will find what's flowering. And their navigation skills are fantastic. They will find the forage. If it's out there, they will get it. In our rural systems, I mean, it has to be said too that there are people that are recognizing the value of pollinators, not only honeybees, and now also the value of having a diversity of crops too. So they'll actually grow rows of insect attracting plants between their trees and stuff like this. It's a slow process, but that system, there are people who are recognizing that our agricultural systems do need to start bringing in a bit more diversity. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, suburbia is fantastic. Brisbane is bee heaven.
Right.
It is, and pretty much year round, because our winters are quite mild. So we don't get that sort of dormant period that they would in Europe so much. They slow down in winter. But also, bees out in a rainforest or any forest, generally the laws of nature are such that something is flowering most of the time. Yeah. There are exceptions, of course, during serious droughts, but there is forage everywhere if we let it grow. Yeah.
And so, do you think, because I guess, like you said, suburbia is good, like bees can survive really well in suburbia because they just go and find the plants that are flowering within that 5 kilometer radius. Do you think at the same time, is there a lack of bees? Is there a need for more people in suburbia, or is there benefit to to suburbia, I suppose, from people having more bees, or more people having bees, maybe.
Sure. So if we accept that bees are responsible for so much of our food, we can also probably accept that so many people who, are much more interested in their own health, in the quality of their food, and are consequently growing their own food. And people are also trying to reduce their food miles. They're sort of bringing food closer to home. It makes sense then, if we're going to try and put fruit and veggie gardens into suburbia, we need to have bees to pollinate those gardens.
Yeah.
So could we have too many bees? Maybe, I suppose, but we haven't got there yet.
Yeah.
And it also needs to be acknowledged that, Australia has 2,000 species of native bee. They are not quite as prolific in terms of their pollination services, but they are here. They're pollinating, and they are valuable to our ecosystem as well. So, so suburban beekeeping is, and people are embracing that quite enthusiastically, but it is it's essential if we want to produce food, and it's far better to be picking an apple from your tree than walking through the doors of the supermarkets to buy one.
Yeah, absolutely. So there'd be a benefit to, in general, people growing their own food, which I think is really important for just the sustainability of our culture. More people growing their own food, and also just for your own health, is getting in touch with nature as much as you can. And then also, like you said, the more people are growing their own food, then the less, I guess, demand there is for those monoculture produced products, which means, if there was enough of that kind of shift, then there would be less habitat destruction of natural habitat destruction.
That's
from
right.
the bees as well.
The ripple effect is enormous. That's right. Yeah. I always tell people, you put a hive in your backyard, it's not really your hive. Those bees are out there in suburbia. They're contributing to the yield of fruit and vegetables from people's gardens. They are, and consequently sort of reducing the number of people that are dependent upon fruit and vegetables from the supermarkets. It is, that hive in that garden, I mean, not only is it a pot of gold in terms of the fact that it just sucks in enormous amounts of honey, but it is out there supporting the planet.
Yeah.
And so, and consequently our health. I mean, that's one of the things that occurred to me about you guys, and why this is quite appropriate to have this relationship with you guys doing the stuff that you do with the Foot Collective. You're into the health of the human body, which essentially, it also means what we put into our bodies. It means the health of the planet, and bees are essentially the health of the planet. This is a much bigger thing than just let's keep bees. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's about human health, insect health, planet health. So it's nice.
It is nice, and that's exactly right. Kind of wherever you start from, we start at feet, because feet are such a misunderstood and mistreated body part in general in society. But if you look at foot health, then you can't separate that from whole body health, because the rest of your body will affect your feet and vice versa. And then obviously you can't separate your whole body health from planetary health, your environmental health. And so wherever you start from, well, you could start from bees and go, okay, what's messing up the bees? Okay, monoculture, agriculture, and what seems to be messing up our health? Well, foods that are from monoculture farms, and so there is really no separation. I think you're exactly right that it all ties in really well together. And I think another big thing about our message is just trying to return to and connect with as much as possible, connect with nature as much as possible, and building a relationship with your own food and animals in your environment makes a lot of sense for returning to that connection with nature. And I'm interested what your thoughts on, I know vegans, for instance, don't eat honey in general, and they are in general against what they see as the the servitude of animals for human benefit and so on. And so, is there an argument out there that it's like, oh, we should just leave the bees alone and not keep them, or like? I mean, I'm pretty convinced that keeping bees makes sense, and based on everything we've just talked about. Like, have you run into that at all, or?
Sure.
Like, I guess the difference between just being a human who's just trying to take from the bees versus being a steward for the bees and helping their survival or helping their success.
Yes. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, there are swings and roundabouts, and the world moves every day in many directions. And if we look at Australia didn't have European honeybees 200 years ago. They're here now because we're here. We demand food. They've been sort of shoehorned into our way of living. And yeah, you could argue, well, that's not, the bees never chose to be here. They don't choose to be in man-made hives. But we're here. We've found ourselves in this environment where, we're not hunter-gatherers anymore. We're farmers, for better or worse. And bees have been caught up in that system. Look, I think it's good to at least have the visibility of a purist system, whatever that may be, but we have to work within what we've got.
Yeah.
And so European honeybees are in Australia, as are we. And we keep bees in hives. And you could argue that, well, if we didn't keep bees in hives, we're not planting enough trees, or at least we're not leaving enough hollow trees standing for even the Australian fauna and birds and stuff. So we really do need to have hives. So, but taking that one step further, you could argue, well, okay, if we're gonna corral bees into our man-made structures, then how can we produce a man-made structure that is at least accommodating their simple needs?
Yes, I wanted to talk about that actually. That's where the top bar hive comes in. Hey?
Yeah. We do bee farming very well in terms of we can pump out honey, we can pump out pollinating bees through the beekeeping industry using a hive called the Langstroth hive. That's the square box that most people are familiar with. It's got frames and wires and all fancy gadgetry inside. It works very well in terms of honey production and being able to stack it onto trucks and ship it around the world. And we're probably not going to change that. And but the purist in me says, okay, well, let's accept that is going on, much as we'd like to sort of improve the pollination industry and lots of other things. But so my thing is basically using a hive called the top bar hive, which is about as close as you can get to a hollow log. So it's basically it is a hive, a box with no infrastructure. There's no frames, no wires. We are allowing the bees to build the comb of their own design, because they will build different size cells in different configurations. So we, first and foremost, the top bar hive is about providing an environment that bees will accept that's pretty close to their normal environment. Whilst at the same time, we also accept that we have a Department of Agriculture that manages bee health and tries to stop nasty diseases coming from the rest of the world into Australia. And as beekeepers, we need to comply with those rules. So we have certain features in the top bar hive that accommodate those compliance requirements as well. So yeah, it would be a great world to have bees everywhere just naturally doing their thing. Yeah. But we currently have a system which we can navigate our way around, and it is my choice to be at that very natural end of beekeeping, where bees are supported and primarily, and secondly, they are there to, they also produce honey and provide pollination. But I don't actually chuck mine on trucks and ship them around.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense, because really the alternative is like, in an ideal world, maybe. Back when we were hunter-gatherers, then there was no agriculture. Then there was just endless homes for bees and plenty of habitat, and everything was going along swimmingly. But obviously, we're, like you said, we're farmers now, and we do have suburbia. And really, the only other option besides people like you taking this on and helping guide other people to do this in their own way in their own backyards, is if someone has a bee colony swarm into their wall, is just to get pest control, really, and to kill the bees, right? Because if they don't get relocated, then what happens if they don't get relocated?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is one of the unhappy outcomes of bees choosing to live in people's walls. Yes, if I can't convince them that I can take them out gently and nicely, but they don't want me to make a hole in the wall, then yes, bees do get killed.
Yeah. So that it makes a lot of sense. Then it's like, well, we absolutely need bee populations for like a lot of different reasons.
I mean, you could argue we need tree populations to start off with.
Yeah.
We need to stop cutting down trees
that's true.
and grow more.
Yeah.
And not only that, but let the dead ones stand. Because the beauty of a dead tree is that enormous hollow cavity that can host birds, bees, and in fact, I was called to a place in St. Lucia some time ago, and a tree lopper, and he was cutting down a tree. I found 3 native beehives and 1 European honeybee hive in the same tree.
Wow.
It is, that habitat is there. We just
get rid of it too soon.
So let's have our man-made hives, but also let's, maybe not be so brutal with our natural habitat.
Yeah. Even a dead tree, you just think, it's just a dead tree, we'll get rid of it. But a dead tree is not truly dead. It's still alive and full.
Part of the cycle of life.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned. Well, we go through it a fair bit in the workshop, but I wonder if you can give us like a brief synopsis of the social life of bees, or just like how the bees work as an organism. Because obviously there's the single individual bee, but then they're really a small part, like a cell of the greater organism, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's a good thing to recognise too, that every bee is selflessly devoted to the well-being of that colony. So getting back to basics, a colony of bees, which typically might be 80,000 bees optimally, there are workers. Mm-hmm. And the workers will make up sort of between 85 to 99% of the population of the bees. Then there are drones, and drones are more plentiful in springtime. They're the males, so they sort of fluctuate between 0 and maybe 15%. And then there's one queen, mostly one queen. There are exceptions, but we won't complicate the matters today. So if we take those 3 types of bees, workers, the girls, drones, the boys, and the queen. The workers are the ones that are doing all the work. So a worker bee is born in the hive, or at least rather she starts life as an egg. The queen lays an egg in a cell in the hive. That egg remains for 3 days, then hatches out and becomes a little white larva. That larva gets fed a substance called bee bread, mixture of pollen and water fermented with a little bit of honey. That larva grows for 6 days, and then the cell gets capped, and that capped cell, or the pupa in that capped cell, continues to grow for another 12 days. So a total of 21 days, that egg becomes a worker bee. That worker bee emerges from her cell. She gets to work. So she cleans out her own cell, and she may operate as a cleaner in her own hive. She will feed brood. She'll feed the drones. She may feed the queen. She produces wax flakes from her abdomen, which then become that fantastic honey comb that they construct, though that's hexagonal cellular stuff out of. Fantastic to see. And she's maybe a heater bee, a guard bee, a housekeeper, throwing out the dead bees. So she works endlessly for about 2 weeks. And then she becomes a forager. In other words, she leaves the hive several times a day, maybe up to 20 times a day, to collect nectar, pollen, sometimes water. And she might visit, 100 flowers in one trip, providing those pollination services between flowers, collecting pollen or nectar, bringing it back to the hive. If she's got nectar, she carries that in her honey gut and shares it with another worker bee in the hive, and they partially digest it again and again. And there's a process that goes on with this nectar which reduces the moisture content, and that nectar becomes honey for use within the hive, or they may store it for future use. They pack it into cells as honey. So that worker bee does that for about 4 weeks until she dies of exhaustion. Her wings will break down. Maybe one day she just doesn't find her way back to the hive. Her life is done. So 2 weeks as a nurse bee in the hive, 4 weeks as a forager. And just to give you some context around that, if you imagine a teaspoon of honey that you might put on your toast in the morning, that teaspoon of honey has required the whole lives of 12 worker bees to produce that little teaspoon.
Is a crazy fun fact.
Yeah,
hey?
So just everyone remember that.
Every time you eat honey, if it's just a teaspoon, think of the 12 worker bees. That is incredible.
It is. It's like gold.
They're really,
yeah. So that's the worker bee,
yeah,
in a nutshell. Then there's the drone. So the drone, he's the boy. He exists for genetic diversity. His job is to mate with a queen from a different hive. So he leaves the hive each day, and he goes up to something called the drone congregation area, which is an area about 30-40 metres above ground. There are several designated areas all around suburbia. He will go to one of those in the hope that he meets a queen. And he will mate with that queen. She will rip his insides out because that's how it's done. And that's the end of his life. He has done his service. If he doesn't mate with the queen, he will go again the next day. So that is his job, and it's an important job. And then there's the queen. So she has an exceptional sort of lifespan. She can live for 4 to 6 years, so she starts her life in the hive. She might spend a few days getting to know her new family when she's just after she's born, and then she knows she has to go out and mate. She's got to go up to that drone congregation area, find some drones. She will mate with about a dozen different drones from a variety of hives, a whole world of genetic diversity going on there.
Rip out all their insides.
Yeah, and then comes back to the hive. And she will start to lay eggs, egg after egg after egg after egg, and she can lay up to 2,000 eggs in one day, which is more than her own body weight.
Isn't that insane?
Yeah.
It still doesn't quite compute, but I guess it's because she's just constantly producing. Yeah, she's just constantly producing. Yeah.
How do you do that? Yeah, she's feeding. She is a machine.
Jeez.
Yeah.
And they use the honey as the queen would be eating honey as her fuel for that.
Yeah. So honey
and
is
they
the
eat
fuel for the hive.
pollen and honey. Well, what do they do? What do they do with
pollen,
the pollen again?
Pollen is mostly used for feeding the brood.
Feeding the brood, yeah.
Because so when you accept that the life of a worker bee is only 6 weeks, they've got to be pumping out new bees day after day after day.
Yeah.
So it's an essential activity for that brood to be pumping out bees 24 hours a day, every day. And so the pollen that's the main use of the pollen is to serve the brood.
Yeah, yep. And then the rest of them eat honey, basically. Yeah.
Honey is so honey is their fuel for travelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And warming, heating, and honey is their daily fuel.
Yeah. And it's just fascinating how I think we were talking about it the other day, how there's all these individual bees, but they have this greater shared intelligence that they even obviously they have their own ways of communication, but it just seems like this seamless single organism that then also splits into two with the swarm, like you were talking about. So it's like this bigger cell made up of a lot of tiny cells, and then that cell can split. It's just it is fascinating how those dynamics work.
A colony of bees doesn't work. It doesn't sort of stick to the, we think we've got a brain, we do things with that brain, we make decisions. A colony of bees, or at least a bee itself, they don't seem to stick with the rules that we understand. In other words, that bee has a job. She knows she's got a job, and she does that in service of the hive. But yes, as you said, there is a mind that appears to make decisions. A hive mind. In other words, that colony makes decisions. Now, I don't think we really understand how that works, but we can observe it. It is unbelievable, and I think it's also. I mean, some people are inclined to think, "Oh, the queen's the boss." She's never the boss. She's the servant of that mind.
Yeah.
And
so there is no boss, really.
No, not at all.
It's all just a constant.
This is a complete collaboration, and you're right. I mean, an example of this is the swarming process. So typically, as we touched on before, swarming is reproduction of a colony of bees. It's when the queen and half the workers leave to set up a new home. And there's a bit of a process because obviously new queens are produced. So the old queen actually produces new queens to take over when she's gone. But somehow there is a process by which there is a bunch of workers that decide they're the ones that are going to go with the queen. They suck up so much honey to survive out in the wilderness for 2 or 3 days while they find their new home, and just watching a swarm go is, there is a process at work that doesn't fit into the constraints of how we understand the human brain.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly they do. They know they have to have the queen. Without the queen, they're lost.
Yeah.
So they do. If the queen gets tired and she falls on the ground, they go on the ground. So they know that the queen is essential to their well-being. But she's not a decision maker as such.
Yeah.
It is. I like we've studied bees a lot. We've studied the waggle dancing and all the ways that they navigate. But I like the fact that so much is so mysterious.
Yeah, it still seems like quite a mystery. And even if you understand those little things, like the waggle dance is interesting. Basically, do you want to describe the waggle dance for people?
Yeah. So the waggle dance is an activity that a worker bee will engage in. If a worker bee's gone out and found some particularly fantastic forage, lots of pollen, beautiful nectar, whatever it is, she comes back to the hive and she will perform this figure of 8 dance surrounded by a whole bunch of worker bees who are observing in some way her dance, and she is communicating to these worker bees the location of the forage that she found. It might be 3 k's away, it might be 4 k's away, it might be in a northeasterly direction. All of that is communicated so that a worker bee getting that message from the waggle dancing worker will go out and find that forage without too much trouble at all. So the waggle dance itself is pretty spectacular.
That is so impressive. And so it's like all these little things, which I'm sure there's a lot more of the examples of that, of how they communicate with each other. There's all those things that we understand, and there's bound to be probably infinite ways that we don't understand still. But it is so fascinating to understand a few of these things, a few of these behaviors, and the way they communicate and the way the hive works, really transforms. Like with your hives, you've got like the flaps, so you can see into them basically through the perspex or glass.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's a lid that you can lift up as well, and so you
Mhm.
can observe some stuff going on there. But it transforms from just this sort of random, chaotic, buzz of activity into now you're actually watching and seeing what some of these bees are doing. Like I remember the other day in the workshop, it was a few months ago now, but you were talking about how in winter, as the climate gets colder, then the bees need less and less space in their hive, and they also need to have therefore less and less bees. And so the drones are pretty expendable because they're not doing any of the work, they're just there to reproduce. So in winter, the worker bees start kicking out the drones.
Yep.
And then straight away we went off to a hive to do some practical application, and then I'm like looking at these bees, I'm like, oh, that's a worker kicking out a drone.
Yes.
And so you start to see, otherwise I would have just been looking at this buzz of activity. So it's a pretty fascinating thing to observe.
It is, and it does take. Just remembering the first time I stuck my head in a beehive at a workshop, and it is pretty overwhelming. You know, it's just bees, right? But yes, it. With a bit of sort of, and I teach people to be observers. You know, we're in so much that we do, we try to interfere. This is wrong, let's fix this. Bees generally know what they're doing. So I always tell people, trust the bees. And the more you just take the time to observe, you'll start to get what they're doing, and you'll watch their movements, and some things you will not understand, and you'll think, why on earth is that bee doing that? You know? But
you don't have to understand it all.
The beauty of just being the observer, yeah. So but you do, as you become more accustomed, you start to recognize the cycles, because they're very deliberate. They're not just, you know, they have a plan, and it's and they're also checking out what's out there. You know, they're driven by what's in the environment around them. If there's nectar and pollen, they will behave accordingly. They'll find it. It will drive whatever happens in the hive. It'll drive the well-being of the hive. If there's a drought, they will respond accordingly. The queen will slow down laying eggs. So you can observe not only how the colony works, but how the colony is building a relationship with its environment. It is quite fantastic and you never, and I think it's also good to think that you know nothing. Yeah. You know, just because that's a good way to approach a hive of bees, because they can always surprise you. Yeah,
just observe and learn. Yeah. And obviously a lot of beekeeping and a lot of maybe potential beekeepers would be thinking about the honey, the results of getting honey, basically. And I will say that your honey is probably the best honey I've ever had. I don't know why, whether the alderly sort of flowers are particularly good, but or maybe with the top bar method being a more natural method. I don't know how much difference that makes to the honey, but yours is delicious, basically.
Thank you.
And you've always got plenty of stores of it. So again, I guess there might be some people that would say, oh, we should just leave all the honey for the bees. How do you know, like, how much to take versus how much to leave? Obviously, you don't want to, sort of hinder their ability to feed themselves. So
yes,
what's the process there?
And as a purist, you would say, well, let's just have a hive and leave them alone. Just on your point though about the honey, I mean, so in a top bar hive, the honey is not put in a centrifugal spinning thing like the commercial framed model. We basically just cut the comb off, and we just run it through a simple strainer. So it gently flows out. It doesn't get sort of aerated. It just flows out straight into a jar. And I think that, you know, the beauty and slowness of that is sort of, I don't know.
Yeah.
It supports the integrity of the honey.
Yeah.
But it is also true that when we harvest from a top bar hive, we are actually harvesting the whole comb. The commercial model is geared towards reusing that comb, spinning the honey out of it and putting the old comb back.
Because it's not actual comb, it's not actual beeswax. That
well,
comb.
it is beeswax,
Oh, they
but
have
it's
a
been
frame.
extruded from a sheet
Yes.
of foundation,
Yeah.
which is sometimes plastic and sometimes wax.
Right. Yeah.
But what I was leading to was if honey is your priority, then this may be important to you, because in a top bar hive you might get about 20% less honey out of a top bar hive, because we're harvesting wax at the same time. But it does mean you get a lot of wax. And bees need to produce wax. They do have to produce wax. They do have to produce comb. So that is something that people might be interested to be aware of. Now, getting back to your other question about should we just have a hive and not harvest honey? This is a tricky thing.
Or I guess, how do you know how much to take?
Oh yeah. Well, that's also part of the thing. So,
yeah.
So going back to a point we raised before, these are European honeybees in Australia.
Yes.
European honeybees are planning for a European winter, which could be minus 10 degrees for 3 months or whatever. In Europe, they're basically shut down. The hive just is in survival mode. In Brisbane, they keep foraging all winter. There's something flowering all the time. So, and bees will always pull in honey. They will not stop just because they think this is enough.
Yeah.
They don't think like that. So, if you let them bring in all of that honey, they will become honey bound. And they will sort of do themselves out of space to make brood.
Right, so they'll just keep making comb and putting honey in it, and then
So the brood is where where all the baby bees are produced. They shrink that brood coming into winter because they just want to tick over gently even in a Brisbane winter. They slow down. But they will still suck in honey and pack that honey around them. Come springtime, they will run out of space very quickly if they're sort of locked in by that honey. So, and additionally, you are required to take the honey out of the hive. A hive becomes unmanageable if you leave it with honey in, and the Department of Agriculture requires that you comply with certain management rules, and typically in Brisbane, there are always exceptions, but they're sucking far more honey than they could use.
Yeah.
So coming to your other question, how much can you take? It's about knowing what you're looking at in the hive, and it's pretty clear fairly quickly that a full bar with a couple of kilos of honey on, they can easily spare it because they are bringing in honey at high speed. They can bring in enormous amounts of honey very quickly if it's out there in the trees. So it's about working with the environment, or at least letting the bees work with the environment, and you work with the bees.
You help support the bees. It's a give and take relationship. You help support them by, I guess, taking care of their environment and making sure that they've got enough space to build if it's hot, and if they've got a smaller, warmer space if it's cold out, and then like you said, trusting the bees that they know what they're doing to a degree, but also just managing it so that it helps support them best. Because if you have the mindset or the intention of like, I want to support this bee colony, not I want to just get as much honey as I can, then it's that give and take, and you can have some honey and I imagine enjoy it and savor it all the more because you know what's gone into the creation of that honey, rather than just sort of
and that is typically the people that come to me for a beehive, and very often they come to me and say, can I have a beehive? I don't really want the honey, but what am I going to do with all that? So
right.
I just want to keep bees. I want them to support my vegetable gardens and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So typically the people that lean towards a top bar hive are people who are primarily interested in bee health, food production, and having an experience teaching the kids. Having an intimate experience with bees.
Yeah.
And I mean, they'll still get 80 kilos of honey in a year, which is
great. It's a great
more
gift.
than enough for most people.
Like if you've got too much yourself, then if you give someone a jar of honey, then it's a pretty special little gift, especially if you sort of grew it yourself, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're right. It's cool that the people you attract are more of those types of people that are just fascinated and passionate about bees and bee health and everything that, all the implications of that. And that's certainly what we're about. Like, obviously, I'm a big fan of honey, and especially the honey that seems to come out of your hives. But, you know, this sort of leads us to the honeybeam project, which was actually started by Nick, for anyone listening who's not aware, but Nick from Canada, the Canadian division, is getting a honeybeam project where basically all the profits from these honey beams that are sold, which are basically yellow beams with a honey logo, but all those profits will go towards setting up and maintaining a beehive and promoting bee awareness. And so, you know, we connected with you and we thought, well, we could do the exact same thing, and that's pretty much what we're going to do, is build a top bar hive with you. We're launching the honey beams this week, hence the podcast, and we'll put all those proceeds to materials for building and the suits that you need and the honey extracting and just workshops with you to help expand our own awareness, and then obviously be able to help us spread the word more. So we really appreciate you collaborating with us like that, because we need someone to guide us, otherwise we'd just be...
Yeah, of course.
I don't know what we do.
I love it. Yeah. If I can be associated with such a good organisation as yours too, which is into, body health and planetary health, and if the bees benefit as well, that's a fantastic bonus as well.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
So we'll set up at least a hive or two out at Bush One, which is our sort of version of Forest One, basically our nature campus that we're building out there, and we also want to start growing some veggies and stuff out there too. So I'm sure it'll help with the pollination. I haven't really now that I think about it, I don't think I've really seen many bees out there, but I'm sure they're out there. Maybe just the smaller native bees that I haven't really noticed, but I guess in those areas there wouldn't be as many European honeybees.
Possibly not.
Yeah.
No, but I'm always surprised because I look into trees all the time, especially flowering trees.
Yeah.
And I look at bees in trees and I think, wow, where's that hive?
Right.
Where are you coming from?
I may just not be looking hard enough. I'm sure in Jenny's, my auntie has a garden out there. I'm sure if I went there, there'd be bees buzzing around. But we'll introduce some more.
Great.
Out of interest, have you noticed that the things that you grow in your garden have been growing better since introducing beehives into your backyard? I know they're not sort of only restricted to your backyard, but have you noticed a difference in your garden?
Yeah, sometimes when a tree is in flower, you can be walking in the garden and you just hear the tree buzzing.
Yeah, right.
It may not necessarily be a fruit or vegetable tree.
Yeah.
I do have fruit trees here, but unfortunately I share most of that fruit with the other animals.
The possums and stuff.
And the reality is, and people do come to me and say, I haven't got much in my garden. I said that the bees don't care. Your fences are no boundary for those bees. They will travel 5 kilometres.
Yeah.
And I have taken... last season I did deliver a hive out to quite agricultural land up north, and it was actually, you had to crane your neck to see a tree, and I thought, no. How are they going to go here? And it was windy, and I thought, you poor bees, where am I bringing you? And they're doing fantastically. So they find it. They figure it out. They find stuff. Yeah. And it's not always in your garden. They will
Yeah.
find it. Yeah.
So people, if you get bees in your backyard, you may not necessarily see a significant increase in your own, I guess, yield.
I think you would.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you've got a good, healthy citrus tree,
You'd start to.
you had a hive to your backyard, I'm sure you would.
Yeah. Okay. I figured there'd be something.
I haven't studied it. But I haven't got a good enough citrus tree to
Ah,
measure
right,
it.
yeah.
But I do have a hive down the street here, and there are citrus trees in his garden. And he said, since the bees have been in there, and he actually copied one of my hives as well. So he's got two hives,
Yeah. Okay.
my hive and his hive in the same garden. And he said, since the bees have been here, it gets way more citrus on his trees than
Yeah,
used to.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. I figured, and also, so there's that aspect, and also then it's just the concept of contributing to the overall picture of bee populations and bee health around the place, so that more so it's not just about your backyard, but it would help your backyard. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone wins.
Yeah.
And then this box that you don't have to feed, you don't have to do anything to. I mean, you got to do
a bit of
inspections
maintenance
and things. It just sucks in enormous amounts of honey.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Hey?
Yeah, it is. It's mind blowing when you open a hive and you think, wow, where did you find the time to do all that?
Yeah, it just sort of does its thing, and you open
Yeah.
it, and there's honey there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
incredible. I'm really, really looking forward to the process, and I'm sure we'll be able to plant some citrus trees out of Bush One as well. So we'll just get a bunch of planting done, and get a couple of hives going, and we'll document the process, and we'll probably maybe in 6 months or a year or so we can do another podcast and maybe dive a bit deeper into bee. The inner workings of the beehive, and or anything else that we learn throughout the process, and I'm stoked.
Great.
Excited.
Yeah, that's good. I'm very pleased to be supporting your cause, and looking forward to hanging out a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, thanks again for chatting, and thanks
you.
everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Cheers.